Welcome back. Now that we've had a chance to look at the worksheet, let's take a shot at filling it out using, say, a deck from a Worlds competitor. Okay, here we have the Day 3 deck of Brandon Nelson. It's the modern portion of Worlds. It's a teachings deck, and it has a nice selection of lands that's going to give us a chance to look at some of the features on the worksheet. So just let you stare at this for a moment. We're also going to include the list in the text of the article along with the other lists that I'm going to talk about today. So you can play along in the home game if you want to. But yeah, basic teachings list. It's got some fetches, got at least one filter land, has some creature duels, has some utility lands, actually has all three of what I labeled as our common utility lands, has some Ravnica duels, has some basics. It pretty much covers the range, including having some lands that aren't on the list. Okay, so that's Nelson's teachings list. Let's pop over to the worksheet and give it a go. Okay, we're back at the worksheet. Now to start things out, there are 6 basic lands in Nelson's list. We have 4 islands, 4, and we have 1 plains, and 1 swamp. And by the way, if you're used to using the earlier mana-based worksheets that I put together, you might notice there's an actual lag sometimes between typing the number in, exiting the cell, maybe saving. That's actually because each new number can actually generate a lot of calculations. And I had a prior version of this where I was using a different approach where it was a lag of seconds upon seconds. This is actually a much cleaner version, which is why this is the one I'm actually debuting to everyone. So just keep that in mind. If it seems a little laggy, yes, your spreadsheet is actually laggy. Okay, so 6 basics, got those covered. Next, the list has 5 of the Ravnica duels, 5 shocklands, starting with a single Godless Shrine, 2 Hallowed Fountains, and 2 Watery Graves. Okay, and next we have a single filter land. So we have a Mystic Gate. So we get to skip all this stuff. Brandon didn't use any of the buddy lands, for example. Later on we're going to look at Ianaga's list and see that he did. But yeah, we go straight to filters, and we have a single Mystic Gate. And then after that, we go to fetches. And so down here, now take a look at what's happened here. Notice that the fetches suddenly have colors they can get. You could ignore the fact that it duplicates a lot of the colors. That has to do with that being easier than making it look pretty. But basically, each fetch is getting populated with the colors it can generate given what other lands there are in the list now. So we've added in Godless Shrine and Hallowed Fountain, and those are both plains, and so that is why Arid Mesa can get white, blue, and black. Because an Arid Mesa can get you both Shrine and Fountain. In fact, Brandon didn't run any Mesas. What he does have are a single copy of Marsh Flats, 3 Misty Rainforests, and 3 Scalding Tarns. Okay, and after that we have creature lands. Brandon has 1 Celestial Colonnade, 1 Creeping Tar Pit. Then down to utility lands, he actually, like I said, has 1 of each. 1 Academy Ruins, 1 Ghost Quarter, 1 Tech Edge. And now we actually need to add in some additional lands because Brandon's list has 1 Dreadship Reef and 2 Talaria West. So Dreadship Reef, 1 of. Now, what are the features of a Dreadship Reef? Well, I'm going to put that it makes colorless because the trick is, in other respects, it's sort of this color filter, color battery kind of feature, and that, a lot like, say, Rampant Growth and other mana fixing, is something that we don't bake into a spreadsheet like this. And in fact, a lot of our interest in this kind of mana-based spreadsheet is what happens in the first 4 turns of the game before a lot of these features kick in. And in the first 4 turns of a game, if you're trying to get colors out of a Dreadship Reef, something has gone horribly wrong. So we're just going to leave it as a colorless land for the purposes of our calculations here. Then Talaria West, 2 of, and Talaria West makes blue and enters tapped. And it's just tremendously useful, even if it's no longer helping you get the giant combo killing 2020. Okay, I'll save that. So I entered a bunch of stuff. That's exciting. What do we know now? Well, let's look at the stats. So Nelson's deck has 27 lands. That's our land count. Has 13 that can produce white mana. And keep in mind, this isn't just things that, what we might say, organically produce white mana, like a Hallowed Fountain or a Plains. This is also, you know, a Misty Rainforest grabbing a Hallowed Fountain, that kind of thing. We have 20 producers of blue mana and 12 black. No red, no green. 4 colorless mana producers, and 4 lands that enter the battlefield tapped, which is pretty respectable, you know, especially for a control deck with 27 lands. Then we can go over and start taking a look at stats that might actually help us out. So over on the right here we have the thing that you're used to from the previous mana-based worksheets, which is, given the color that I want, say white, how likely am I to get it in 6 cards, 7 cards, 8 cards, 9 cards, 10. So, you know, 7 cards is your nominal opening hand, 6 is with a mulligan. I tend to like the 10 cards because 10 cards is turn 4 on the play. You know, will I see this color by turn 4 on the play using my natural progression with no searching, no fixing? And so we see for Brandon's deck, you know, you're approaching guaranteed to have blue by turn 4, and really, you know, very early. It's 95% in your opening hand that you'll have a blue source. And, you know, the odds are not as good for the white and black, but, you know, given the way his actual deck is built, you know, he was happy with that layout. And here's where we go for another one of these, but, and by the way, now you can see why I write but as a sort of sentence on its own in some of my articles. This is just looking at color in opening hands. So that means it's counting things like, and I've mentioned this before, the opening hand that has 1 Hallowed Fountain and all 5 and 6 drops. That is not a keepable hand. However, as I mentioned today, you know, we're not going to model the full depth of what is a keepable hand or not. You know, that really does involve your deck, your opponent's deck. I mean, even knowing how the opponent's going to play. You know, that's why we actually have players playing the game and don't just run little chess robots at each other. So, you can still make some approximations around this though. You know, in general, for most decks, a hand with no lands is not keepable, obviously, and a hand with 1 land or 7 lands or 6 lands, those tend to not be keepable either. So, check out the next calculation. Now this calculation is based on the actual land tally in your deck. So like Brandon's deck is almost half land. And this is a good time to mention that the spreadsheet here, the worksheet, still assumes 60 card decks. I will change it so that you can put in the deck size of your choice in the near future. But again, sort of, you know, only so many moving parts at one time, and I didn't want to deal with that yet. So here are the straight odds for having the different sets of lands in your opening hand. You know, Brandon's deck produces a 4 land opening hand roughly a quarter of the time. And that'll happen when your deck is like half land. Now we have 2 categories here. Careful and safe are my clever names for them. So careful says I am not going to keep a 1-lander or a no-lander, obviously, and I'm not going to keep a 6 or a 7-lander. And so 88% of the time, a little over, Brandon's deck gives you a careful hand. Now really, a lot of the time, especially in a deck like this, a 2-lander is suicidal. And a 5-lander is kind of terrible too, and what your sweet spot is having 3 or 4 lands and whatever other cards. And there, we're looking at 56% of the time. Now, I mentioned this because, well, these color stats can be a little misleading because they do include those hands that you can't keep. So, instead we have the 2 filtered modes here, which use these sort of initial hand odds as a rough filter for your keepable hands. And what this means is that, you know, for an opening hand here, we say under careful consideration, as it were, we get blue in a keepable hand 84% of the time. And under safe considerations, we get blue in a keepable hand a little over half the time. And what you're actually going to start to see pretty frequently here is that the safe mana requirements are too strict. You know, you look at this, you would just never play the game. but it does speak to things like why we like Preordain, why we like Ponder, and other helpful cards that are banned in Modern. And I have different articles about what these things do for you. A Ponder is basically basically worth a mulligan all on its own, and that's why it can really help you out here. But I think the careful category, this sort of first category, is a really good guideline for, under realistic real-world considerations, am I going to get the colors I need when I need them? And these are all these stats are generated from the numbers that you're actually putting in, which of course is again why Brendan's deck has nothing in red, nothing in green, because it doesn't do those things. Finally, for the stats that we currently have, we have what I call the land harm index, which sounds like one of those economic indicators that will have people buying or not buying houses or change interest rates. It's like the Case-Shiller for mana bases. So what this is actually doing is it's calculating, given your fetch lands, shock lands, and pain lands, sort of an average damage by turn of the game. And so it's a really rough average, and what this really is sort of an indicator of how hurty is my mana base. And so here on turn 1 we are at just below a point, on turn 2 about 1.3 points, and so on and so forth. And on its own this is not going to make a lot of sense to you, but it will start to make sense once you change the number of lands that you have. For example, I have a tendency to lean very heavily on fetches and shocks. If you looked at the Snapcaster Gifts list that I wrote about last month, it has 7 fetches and 8 shock lands, which is a much heavier load of both than most players go for. And actually, it was looking at this land harm index that made me think it's probably too much. But it's a useful way of evaluating, do I really need to be as shocky and fetchy as I currently am? And then you can do the compare-contrast with other things like, are my buddy lands actually coming in untapped? And we'll take a look at that in the next section, for example, with Ianaga's list. So that's basically how you work the spreadsheet. You type in numbers for most of the lands, and then you add in any lands that you need at the bottom, and then it gives you these stats at the end. Pretty cool. So in the next part, we're going to take a look at a couple more deck lists from the recent Worlds Modern section and see how the stats can help us understand these mana bases and how that can help guide us in building our own mana bases. So I'll see you in part 3.